The following is from the June 1994 book Never Fade Away by Dave Thompson. On Sunday, April 3rd, according to a source close to the band, Courtney and Geffen arranged for private detectives to be hired to trace Kurt. It was their belief that he would probably head back to Seattle. Kurt was, in fact, already there. He arrived on Wednesday, March 30th, the same day he left the rehab facility, and contacted his old friend Dylan Carlson, guitarist with Olympia's band Earth and the best man at Kurt and Courtney's marriage 2 years before. Kurt asked Dylan if he would go with him to buy a shotgun. He said he wanted it for protection, Dylan explained later, which seemed reasonable enough. So did Kurt's request that Dylan make the actual purchase. He was worried, Dylan said, that if he bought it in his own name, the police would simply come around and confiscate it. He and the Seattle Police Department had quite a history in that respect, as Dylan himself knew. The Taurus .380, which had been taken away just a couple of weeks before, had been registered in Carlson's name. It was also one of the guns which had been temporarily impounded the previous June. The pair set off for Stan Baker's gun shop on Lake City Way Northeast. Baker later remembered wondering, what the hell are those kids going to do with that shotgun? It's not hunting season. But it was not his concern either. Dylan purchased the weapon, a 16-pound Remington Model 11 20-gauge shotgun, and the two left the store. Dylan later asked Kurt if he wanted him to keep the rifle at his condo. Kurt told him no. That day was to be their last meeting. Where Kurt went from there may never be known for certain. Later on Wednesday, he was in a downtown gun shop buying a second box of shells. He did spend at least one night at a property he and Courtney had bought the previous year, a little north of Carnation, a township 40 miles northeast of Seattle. Courtney would tell Seattle's Post-Intelligencer newspaper that it looked as though he'd had company as well. Balled up by a fireplace in the still unfinished two-story house which the couple were building lay a blue sleeping bag which she had never seen before. A nearby ashtray overflowed with cigarette butts. Some she recognized as Kurt's brand, but as for the others, she'd not seen them before either. On Monday, the day after the private detectives were taken on, Courtney was interviewed by the LA Times' Robert Hilburn. She spoke of the horror of finding Kurt spread out on the floor in Rome, blue and still. "I don't ever want to see him like that again. I thought I went through a lot of hard times over the years, but that was the hardest." It was the last scheduled interview she would do. The following afternoon, callers were informed by the hotel switchboard that her room was not accepting any calls whatsoever. An interview with the Seattle Rocket was canceled without warning, although Hole guitarist Eric Erlandson explained simply that Courtney was feeling unwell. He promised that he would try to reschedule the telephone interview for later that evening. He didn't. In fact, Courtney probably wasn't even at the hotel. Instead, she was combing the streets of LA, searching for her husband. Back home, Cobain's mother, Wendy O'Connor, was instituting a search of her own, filing a missing persons report with the Seattle Police Department on Monday. Word had reached her that her son had bought a shotgun. In the report, she described him as armed and possibly suicidal. But somewhat mysteriously, he was not considered dangerous. Back in LA, Courtney was voicing similar anxieties. "I'm really afraid for him right now," she told a friend. In the days that followed, the Seattle Police Department paid several visits to the Cobains' Madrona home. There was no sign of life. They would also check out the address on Seattle's Capitol Hill where O'Connor claimed her son bought his drugs. Again, however, there was nothing. Courtney remained in LA, wrestling now with both her own conscience and the calm advice of friends.
Every instinct in her body was screaming she should return to Seattle to join the search for Kurt. But other people, she admitted later, counseled her simply to sit tight. They knew as well as she did how volatile Kurt could be when he wanted, how he would so often do one thing when he was asked to do another. The last thing anybody needed was for him to storm off in a fit of contrariness and maybe do something stupid. I listened to too many people, Courtney confesses. I'm only going to listen to my gut for the rest of my life. At the time, however, the advice seemed sensible. The private detectives had apparently made some headway in their search for Kurt. Contact had been made, but Kurt refused to be taken back to LA. Instead, he turned and fled. He remained in sight, though, and while the idea of physically harnessing Kurt was reluctantly dropped from the game plan, according to a source, a friend was directed to keep tabs on him. What the fuck? Is this the version you remember? If you read the first reports, it fits. Kurt goes to Exodus on the 28th and leaves on the 30th. John Silva runs into Kurt and Charles Peterson sees him on Capitol Hill. The detectives having made contact with Kurt and keeping him in sight is news to me.